Welcome back. We're starting a new chapter today on customer-driven marketing strategy. Much of this is going to seem familiar to things that we've discussed before, particularly about market segmentation and market targeting. But we're going to go a little more depth into those things about how to how to basically create those. So things we talked about before about demographics and psychographics are going to come up today. We're going to give a lot more about how this is applied for firms in everyday life and everyday business. So let's start with roadmap. Um, we're going to go over what are the elements of a customer-driven marketing strategy, and two of these kind of speak for themselves. One of them is going to be market segmentation. The other one is going to be market targeting. Later on, we're going to talk about positioning and making our value proposition, but we'll do that in the subsequent video lecture. The second thing, we're going to look at how do firms segment customers. So this is just kind of a breakdown of the different types of segmentation schemes that firms and marketing firms use. And lastly, we're going to look about three kind of broad categories of segmentation: behavioral segmentation, psychographic segmentation, and demographic segmentation, and how they differ from each other. So that being said, let's begin. So this is kind of a graphic kind of summary of, let's say, what a customer-driven marketing strategy is. Remember, when we talk about customer-driven, it means that we're not focusing so much on the product, we're focusing on what the aspects and characteristics of the customer and things that create the greatest value from that. Once we establish the value, create value for the customer, then we can capture part of that value by selling them to our product. But the idea is not to focus on the product itself and the characteristics of that, but on the person who is making the decision about the product, so our target. So the first, we're going to mostly deal in this video lecture on the left-hand side of this diagram. We're going to look at segmentation, which is how you can divide the market up. Instead of trying to sell the entire market the same product, we might, in a sense, break the market up into different pieces, whether demographically, psychographically, or behaviorally. And then we're going to target different segments, the ones that match best our product or that we can serve best, and target our marketing strategy toward them. In the next video lecture, we're going to look at differentiation, which means how do we differentiate ourselves from other types of other firms and their products. So why is our product a greater value to our customer than our competitors? And lastly, how do we position ourselves in the mind? Are we going to position ourselves as the best price, the highest quality, vis-a-vis our competitors? So what is segmentation? And as I said at the beginning, we've done this before, and so this is a little bit of a review, but I'm going to go a little more into depth in some of the applications today. Segmentation is about dividing the market into two segments. So segments are, let's say, pieces of the total market. So you probably in geometry, you've heard about line segments. Market segment is very similar to a line segment. It's a piece of the total. And that these are segments, or these are parts of the entire market that have needs, characteristics, behaviors that make them different. So for example, it might be old versus young, it might be male versus female, it might be professionals versus amateurs, and you can divide it up into a lot of different ways. And since their needs are going to be different, how you're going to approach them and how you're going to connect to them through your marketing strategy is going to be different. So you might, in a sense, use a different marketing mix for different market segments. And just once again, as a recall, the marketing mix is the 4 Ps: product, price, place, and promotion. And so what mix you choose for different market segments is going to vary. And so, as we've talked about before, demographic, psychographic, behavioral characteristics. Geographic is just more about location, about different areas of the country. So those are things that we don't control so much, but might vary from place to place. So there's no such thing as one way to segment the market. It's going to vary by product. It's going to vary by, let's say, the market. It's going to vary by a variety of different things. And so there's not like a single best way to do this. And this is kind of connected to a broader point about categorization. When you create categories and you create concepts, the point about them is not whether they're true or false. The point about them is whether they're useful or not. If they're useful for you to understand the diversity or the complexity of the market, then you should go ahead with these categories and market segments. And so sometimes you'll see people redescribe them or use new vocabulary or create combined categories by like doing something, for example, age and, let's say, race, or maybe something like strong customer and age group and things of that sort. You can combine them and create more, let's say, granular segments when you approach that. So market segmentation, the first general category is geographic. This can be whole nations. As I said in previous lectures, marketing in Japan is very different than marketing in the United States. Japanese take packaging very seriously, and therefore a poorly packaged product is probably not going to sell in Japan, even if the quality or the price of the product are favorable. Geographic might also do about differences in clothing and furniture, given things like the climate, or given things about the types of houses or homes that people have in different countries. Different types of products might fit in better. So for example, in the United States, kitchens are quite large compared to most of the rest of the world, and therefore you can sell larger, bigger refrigerators, bigger stoves, bigger dishwashers. But if in a lot of both Europe and in East Asia, kitchens are a lot smaller because people tend to eat out a lot more on a daily basis, and so what you have is relatively small. So the standard, let's say, stove is about 30, 32 inches in the United States. In East Asia and Japan, it's probably about 20 inches wide. And so, the idea of being bigger, better, more capacity is not necessarily the same selling point in East Asia as it would be in the United States. But even within countries, you can talk about regions of the country. Some of this can be climate and weather in different parts. It can be regional. Let's say food products. Pizza flavors differ by region of the country. Barbecue flavors vary by region of the country. And therefore not everything is going to have the same purchase everywhere. And as I said, you can break this down to neighborhoods. One very common, let's say, a local thing is zip code. And the reason why zip code is used is because zip codes are usually collected when you sign up, when you make a purchase, when you make a credit card sale, when you have like a frequent buyer's card. Usually what you have there is a zip code, and therefore you can aggregate people by their zip code. And the zip codes might be more useful than, let's say, something like town, which is relatively small. So like zip codes, sometimes you have sub-zip codes, so the 4-digit after the base zip code, and that can break you down even to neighborhoods. But the reason why zip codes are important is that think about just in our local area, the difference between Crown Pond, Shrub Oak, Mohegan Lake, Mayapack, Cortland Manor, Verplank, Peekskill, Garrison. These are all different zip codes within our district, but they're kind of, you can note, and if you know them in, as we do locally because we live here, these are very different types of communities. So both in terms of wealth, affluence, types of houses that tend to be the age of different neighborhoods can matter and factor in. And the reason why the age of neighborhoods might matter is that neighborhoods have a natural kind of turning over, which means people tend to buy houses in their 30s and 40s and tend to leave their houses in 60s and 70s. And so you kind of have a 30-year kind of neighborhood turnover cycle that generally goes on. And because initially when the neighborhood was built, all the housing units were sold at the same time, everyone ages kind of in a synchronized way, and that can matter. So one example of this is like geographically things like zip cars. Now, if you live in the city, a lot of people do not own their own cars, and therefore renting a car it makes a lot more sense. While if you live in a suburban area, most people, or rural area, most people own their own vehicles, and they're not going to be big into renting. You can see this with rent-a-cars tend to be concentrated around things, hotels, airports, transportation hubs. And you see this very often in large cities because, like in New York City, a lot of people use the subway to go around, and therefore the idea of renting a car for short trips or for a weekend ride makes a lot of sense. While that would not be a very good strategy if that was being done in the suburbs, it probably wouldn't find as many customers. You also find this in terms of college campuses because while some college students have their own cars, many do not, and they might use it for a shopping trip, they might use it for running an errand, and therefore you might see more volume in terms of demand for this. So this is something that gets geographically segmented. Demographically, we also talk about this. These are basically objective ways of defining groups of people. So age, old versus young, gender, male versus female, family size. So a family that has children or family that has a lot of children is very different than a small family, or a single household, or just a 2-adult household. For example, a large family is going to have small children. You're going to see more diapers. You're going to see toys. You're going to see more things that are targeted around conveniences. They're probably going to buy larger cars because you need to go around and bring the family, so it's something more like a van or a minivan. It can matter in the family life cycle, which means is it before children, is it young children, is it older children? Can change things. Income for obviously wealthy versus poor versus middle class. Occupation, some occupations are more likely to work with their hands versus white collar jobs. So you might see something that, for example, like tools. Some people take tools very seriously. Some people just want something to work. So if you're a professional contractor, you're probably going to opt for higher quality tools. And if you're not, you might do something that is just good enough to do a small job. Education. So we talked about these before and why they matter, but the point is these are usually things that we can objectively tie, usually because the census collects information on all of these, and we're not doing it mostly to target individual customers. So we can look at, let's say, the distributions or the percentage of people that fall into different categories in different communities and use this as a way of targeting these markets. So for example, if we have an older community versus a younger community, we have more women than men. This means, and this is not just, let's say, physical places. For example, on different social media platforms, you might see a greater distribution of one group versus the other, and therefore kind of target your marketing campaign where you're more likely to find customers that are going to find your see value in your product. The other thing about it is that demographics tell you a lot about how people are going to use your products, and I kind of suggested some of these before about things like diapers don't matter to people who do not have small children, but it can matter a huge amount for ones that do. I just said this as a new parent. It's something that I would never have thought about before, but something that I've learned in granular detail as my son is growing up and over his first year. The last thing about demographics is they're kind of objective and they're easy to quantify, which means because the census collects data on these and on a regular collects data regularly, the recent data is going to be readily available to you at low cost and something that is quantifiable, therefore going to be well used for quantitative analysis. So talking about life cycle, something that we haven't talked about before, but I think that, as I was suggesting, young versus old is a basic difference, but just because someone is a certain age doesn't mean that everyone ages synchronously. So, for example, you might say that most people have children in their late 20s, 30s in the United States, but some people start later. Some old people are more sedentary than others, and therefore avoid the stereotypes and promotions based on age. So the point about it is that if you are an old but active person, you might resent have products target you as if you're feeble or senile and things of that sort. You want to promote positive messages, which means in some ways age-based products are more aspirational than descriptive. So teenagers do not want to be treated as children, they want to be treated as young adults. Old people do not want to be treated as like senior citizens, they want to be treated as, let's say, more like working age people because that's where their identity is linked to. Gender. A big thing about this, while there are some stereotypical products that are typical of one gender more than the other, it can also be used as something that's underutilized, which means that you see this particularly with sports and other things that are more stereotypically male products. Because men have typically had a lot more power in society, many of the things that are typically male products are also seen as signifiers or symbols of mate, power, etc., and therefore can be attractive to women as they enter the workforce. And as, let's say, gender is not a static category, it's changed over time. As more women are working, more women are heads of households, things that would have applied to men in the past might be more, let's say, attractive to the segment and therefore also underutilized. The point is basically you can treat it as a new market. And so what you see here is one good example of Harley Davidson, American-made motorcycles, and they used to be a very much male-centric, male-dominated market. But what Harley Davidson's finding is that they are broadening their appeal to women. Another good example, just staying kind of with vehicles, is NASCAR. When NASCAR was typically a very male-dominated spectator sport, And what they found is that more and more of their audience was actually female, and you saw things like promoting Danica Patrick, a very talented driver. But the point is why she was good for marketing is because she would allowed a different segment, a different part of the gender segment to be drawn in and more identifiable with NASCAR racing. I think also you're seeing things like a lot of very masculine macho products, NFL, etc., are doing a lot of things with breast cancer awareness. So you see, pink in the uniforms and things of that sort. And a lot of this is kind of acknowledging that it works two ways. One is to attract more women to your product, but the other one is to kind of develop a reputation of being favorable to women, even among your male customers. Income, so this luxury goods versus bargain buys. Some products clearly kind of advertise themselves as being for the affluent. We saw this with some of our water products in our project on that, is that some people went for a very basic approach, and other people went for more of a high-end approach. Now, but what I've also said is that just because people are poor does not mean that you should avoid them as customers. I mentioned before, the biggest growing retail stores are not let's say the middle retailers like Sears or even Walmart anymore. What you see is luxury at the top, but then you also see dollar stores are a really growing segment of the retail market. So things like Family Dollar, Dollar Tree, Dollar General are breaking into places they weren't before, because even though individually low-income people might not have a lot of money to spend, there are a lot of low-income people, and therefore they still buy a lot of things in total. And so you can make up for volume what you might lose in price by targeting that demographic. We live in a more polarized in terms of income, and we live in let's say, a down market. Targeting, let's say, a growing, widening middle class that was very common in the 1950s and 60s during that period of the broad growth in American society is probably not something that is going to work where you see a lot more income segmentation going on. So speaking of one example with a luxury product, here we have Benjamin's Hotel. I have 2 dogs. I'm sure many of you do as well. Some people, animals, get better food and better treatment than sometimes their human owners. And so this is kind of an idea of catering and taking care of a dog. Now, a dog is not a consumer, but the owner might take it very seriously. Just an example of how much people can spend on their dogs. Leona Helmsley, who was part owner of the Empire State Building for a while, when she died, she left most of her fortune to take care of her dogs, like multiple millions of dollars. And rather than give the money to her children or give her money to charity. And I think that kind of suggests like the orientation that some people have. There's a market out here for pampering pets. Near me in a place called Middle Hope, there's a luxury pet resort which advertises like the AstroTurf field and the water park, and the dog is not just kept there and fed and kept in a kennel, but they're going to be more active. And anyone who has a close relationship with an animal probably can identify with this. Personally, this is one place where people can disagree. I think this might be treating maybe dogs too well. But, as I said, there's a market for it, and there's a segment, and this is a way of using income for people to spend money on, let's say, dependents. So other ways to segment the market other than demographics or psychographics and behavioral segmentation. I'm going to take up behavioral segmentation first. What behavioral segmentation is about dividing people by how often they use, how well they know. So, for example, people who know a lot about a product are people that spend a lot of time researching a product. So this might be an expert or professional group. So if you're a professional gamer, what you consider a adequate like controller or an adequate, let's say, headphones is maybe different than someone who only is doing it from time to time. Someone who buys a product a lot. So I was talking about diapers, or if you own pets, dog food, you might, let's say, it's a repeat buy. and therefore you might separate people who are regular buyers versus people who are more like butterflies that maybe use your product every and occasionally. Because if that's your core market, if they're making most of the purchases of that, you might want to treat them differently than, let's say, your buyers as a whole. Psychographic segmentation are things that bring people together but are not, let's say, objective descriptors of, let's say, them as a group. So, for example, social class is different than income. Many people who have low income might have high social class and vice versa. So, for example, a college student has very little income, but might have someone who's a graduate student, particularly, might have aspirations to a higher social class professional lifestyle. So, this can be, for example, people who spend a lot of time in leisure activities, or people who hardcore sports fans who go see every game and spend a larger share of their income on tickets and paraphernalia and things of that sort. These are things that you basically have to survey for and find out people's likes and dislikes because they're not going to be readily observable in an objective way. So you're not going to be able to get this through census data or things of that sort, but you might be able to conduct market research to identify this. So these are things that might come up, and we talked about market research and we talked about how to do surveys. This might be something that might be a different type of segmentation. So generally, this is like when you're selling things based on a lifestyle or aspiration. So someone might be living in an urban, suburban area, but might see themselves as very outdoorsy, and so you might sell them something like Columbia sportswear, and they might drive an SUV and a four-wheel drive all-terrain vehicle, even though where they're living is not objectively needs that type of product. So behavioral segmentation is sometimes that people tend to do things in predictable ways. So, for example, people buy more on holidays and gift-giving seasons than other times, and so you might see differentiation or a different product. Pumpkin spice that comes out every single October every year for Dunkin' Donuts, and just about seems everything else. You might do something that is more Christmassy, so you might see like chocolate mint becoming more. You might see things, for example, early summertime, Memorial Day, things that are more like outdoors and yard work. The second thing is that people might want different features in your market. So people who drive motorcycles versus automobiles are a different segment in the market. You might see things like people who have, so this is showing you Geico, and Geico basically is about saving money. 10% is usually what their pitch is, and Geico stands for Government Employees Insurance Company. So this is something that was once targeted mostly at municipal workers and state workers and things of that sort, and then later branched out to a much larger demographic. But one of the things that, as a Geico customer, that I like is the roadside service tends to be relatively comprehensive, and so I've had a very good experience with that. And they seem to give a better package of products, while other people might target people who are better drivers or driving more, driving trucks, commercial driver's license and things of that sort. And so these are things that might be differentiated or segmented behaviorally. And so what I was trying to point about the seasonality, I think, is a key aspect of this, which means that people tend to buy more stuff at certain times of the year. In the spring, people are all doing yard work, and so you might see things with like yard tools and power pressure washers and things like that go on sale. When you see the early winter season in the Northeast, you might see things like snow shovels and snow blowers and warm weather gear and gloves and things of that sort. And so because you see that pattern, and you might see kind of rotation seasonally, but also maybe geographically, like the one thing that I didn't know as living in the Northeast and the Southeast in their hurricane and tornado season, people usually have a stock up in anticipation of hurricanes, and so you have sales where people buy things that can make you last through a hurricane if you lose power and things of that sort, as well as food and water, etc. So one just thing to think about here is that it's not, and we'll talk more about pricing, is that people might be willing to buy a more expensive offering if certain benefits are some benefits are available. So one thing that I'm looking at now, just to give an example of this, is that I'm looking at buying a wheelbarrow. And wheelbarrows range in prices from about $40 to about $200. And basically, wheelbarrows are pretty much the same. They have a capacity, they're made of certain materials, they haul stuff around. There's no technology. But the one that I'm probably going to buy is not the cheapest one. And the reason for that is because what I'm going to use it for is moving around rocks and stones and things that are going to be not just heavy in terms of weight, but also kind of, let's say, are going to maybe damage that. So I'm looking at something that is made out of a higher grade steel so that it can hold up to kind of rough use. And so I'm seeing that some wheelbarrows are more for gardening and, light yard work, and some of them are more for more contractor construction job. Uh, um, and so this is something where someone might look at the benefits and might, let's say, spend more on that. So I also talked about, shopping for car insurance. One of the things that might matter in car insurance are some of the add-on benefits, such as uh, some of this is regulated by the state, so car insurance varies by state, but it can be something like the level of deductibles, the no-fault insurance, the roadside service, which all can be important above and beyond just insuring your car against damage and also loss of life during an accident. So one other thing about seasonality is, so we've all seen these are Peeps. They originally were very much an Easter, springtime thing. What Peeps has done is that over the course of the year, there are Peeps for every season, for Halloween, for Christmas, for Valentine's Day, etc. And so rather than just have the standard bunnies and little I guess little birds, you've seen them branch out different colors. I think these are hideous. I can't stand them. Frankly, for someone with a sweet tooth, these make me want to puke. But I think the point about it is that there's a following because they're readily available and they're kind of, if you say Peeps, people all know what you mean by that as far as, let's say, something that you buy. And so by segmenting themselves for different holidays is kind of a way of location segmentation that's going on and behavioral segmentation. So some other ways you can use behavioral segmentation is by usage. And so you might figure you might want to target people who don't already buy your product, non-users, so people who are first-time users and people who have no experience. You might have people who are angry or used to use your product and no longer use it. Idea returning. You see this very often with cell phone plans. Not so much now, but in a time where people would jump back and forth, and the idea is like, used to have a plan with us, we still have your contact information, can we offer you a better deal? So you might basically segment based on whether they've used your product before, they're current users, they have used your product and then left, or they're first time users. It's very often what you see this is that with digital devices, the idea that if you get them to use your product for the first time they're using a phone, people tend to get accustomed to something and they stay with it over the long haul. Even if the functionality and the price change and are not necessarily optimal, people kind of buy in routines. Usage rate, I think this is pretty straightforward. People who are light users versus heavy users, so this can be the difference between an amateur and a professional for like Home Depot or Lowe's. And then there's kind of loyalty. So I think people are very strong Apple versus Android users. My wife buys every Apple device under the sun. I'm an Android Amazon person, and so I tend to, and you see this not just in terms of like the marketing and building a culture around that. You also see this in terms of like it's the peripherals that go with that. So a big thing I find with phones is like whether you can plug in your headphones or not into it. And there are people who are very strongly loyal, and there are people who are not so much. Another example of this might be Twizzlers versus Red Vines. Some people only have Twizzlers, some people only have Red Vines, and so you can divide that. Some people are very strong and loyal, and then there's maybe a group in the middle that is indifferent. You see this a lot, I think, with political marketing, where you have people talk about appealing to your base and appealing to swing voters. Your base are basically, you're trying to get an intensity. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about Pepsi and Coca-Cola and Ford and GM, is that sometimes their strategy dividing up the market is to get fewer customers that buy more volume of your product versus to have kind of a larger but loosely tied customer base. So one way to do this is to kind of not just use one cut, which means not just use age, not to use behavior, not just use psychographics or demographics, but to combine these into smaller and better defined groups. So you basically might start with elderly people, then you might elderly people who live in the Northeast, elderly people who live in the Northeast that have children who live nearby, elderly children, and you can get smaller and smaller groups, and then you can get differences in buying patterns. And as I said before, very often the zip code is the basic unit for targeting different communities because a lot of marketing information is tied to zip code because it's either on your credit card sale or it's you shop in a particular store or you have a kind of a card that you scan when you make purchases, and that in a sense connects your customer information to the types of items you're purchasing. Now this doesn't mean they know exactly who you are, but they can identify, connect your purchase behavior with your demographics and your zip code as a way to organize it geographically. And zip code also confers a lot of other information. Usually zip code is related to income. Usually zip code is related to kind of subculture or lifestyle. So there are some types of segmentation systems, and one common one is called Prism. It's becoming much more common. So, where everything's being digitized in big data, you can get large data and kind of, micro-target different groups that you might want to attract. So what makes an effective segmentation? Now, we said before that there's no one way to segment the market, and there's no one best way to segment the market. But generally, to be a market segment that you can actually use in your marketing strategy, it's going to have 5 characteristics. The first one is that it's measurable. And measurable doesn't necessarily mean quantitative. It just means something that it isn't just impressionistic. So something is that you can compare groups, but also if you can't measure it, it's hard to differentiate groups from each other. So for example, there might be outdoorsy people and there might be, let's say, more urban people, but unless you can measure that in the sense of what degree are people more outdoorsy and what degree are people more urban, it's not necessarily a useful way because I can't really divide people unless I have a way to measure it. It has to be accessible, which means it has to be something that you can actually get data on. There might be things you can measure, but you have to spend a lot of money, and therefore it might not be worth the cost of collecting that information because the difference in value created and the difference in sales made is not going to justify the cost in gathering information. The difference has to be substantial. So subtle differences, i.e., 13 versus 14, is maybe a 13-year-old versus a 14-year-old is not a substantial difference. They're going to be very similar, but the difference between a high school student and like a high school senior and a college freshman could be substantial. And that means, there's going to be a big difference in terms of their behavior. There's going to be a difference in terms of their location and what their needs and wants are going to be. Differentiable means you can actually, this goes to the measurables, that you can appeal to them in a different way. And lastly, actionable, which means you can actually have a marketing strategy that will be able to target these groups and be able to present, let's say, them different markets or different types of appeals in your marketing strategy. So this is trying to, it's hard to measure like left-handed people because even though there clearly are left-handed people and right-handed people, we generally don't know who they are. People don't write down whether they're left-handed or right-handed in any way that's collected by the census. It's not necessarily something you're going to ask on a survey. And even though there are a lot of things that left-handed people require, because most things are designed for right-handed people, so things like scissors or utensils or tools or even watches would be better if they're left-handed. But the point is, you don't know where they are, and you don't know how to measure it, and you don't know what degree people are left-handed. Some people are ambidextrous and use both hands, and some people will use their weak hand and just adjust, and because it's not a big difference to them, even though it's not the optimal, let's say, product, it's a good enough product, and they might settle for that. So let's talk about market targeting. So the first part, we talked about segmentation, which is more about how do we conceptualize and how do we categorize the customers. Targeting is how you're going to, once you've broken them up, choosing which ones you're going to target your marketing appeals to. So you evaluate them, and you might decide like you maybe want to sell to wealthier people versus poor. You might want to sell to women versus men, and you're going to evaluate these, which are the most desirable markets. So one is just the segment size. So you don't necessarily want to have the biggest segment, because the biggest segment might be a little bit amorphous. It requires maybe more volume than you're able to deliver on. It means that you're maybe have a higher profile. You might want to, let's say, have a smaller operation that targets a very direct segment that is going to. So just to go back to an example we used before about Pepsi versus Coca-Cola, there are more Pepsi drinkers, so the segment of Pepsi drinkers is larger. What Coca-Cola does is that they have a smaller but more loyal segment, and so by selling fewer, you know, by by selling to fewer people but get more sales per customer, that might be, let's say, a better way, because you only have to appeal to that customer once and you get multiple sales, while having a larger segment that maybe makes a more occasional sales. Another example of this might be sports fans. So the Yankees are one of the largest baseball segments out there, but the Yankee fans are not just in the metropolitan New York City area, they're all over the country, and therefore distribution to them, it might be a lot more difficult than focusing on, let's say, one that has a very local presence or a local team. There can be aspects that are, the structural attractiveness, which means how many competitors you have out there. So you might not want, even though there's an attractive segment, there might be other people might have figured out that this is an attractive segment, and so the market can be saturated. There can be substitute products that might be cheaper than you, and therefore you're looking for segments that you can kind of have control over and maybe have a monopoly position, because once you've captured and won the loyalty to that segment, you become their supplier of first choice. And they have to fit in with your overall company objectives and company resources. So for example, if you're a relatively small company, you don't necessarily want to expand too much, because you can overextend yourself and find yourself in a position and therefore not meet the expectations that you raised among your customer base, because you can't deliver the value products. So marketing targeting is that you can go from micro marketing, which means targeting very individual people or local people. So this would be an example of where you're seeing this more with geo-tracking on phones, where is that as your phone passes a certain area, they know the history of your purchases stored on your phone through cookies, and they might target an ad that only you see. And this happens a lot when people browse on the internet, which is that the ads you see on the same page that I would go to are going to be different, because yours reflect your buying patterns and the ads I see reflect my buying patterns. The most broadly, usually might call broadcast marketing or undifferentiated marketing, means you're basically sending out the same message to everyone, and you are trying to get things like over the most comprehensive, or the method that reaches the most people. So it could be a Super Bowl ad, it could be advertising on a major network, and there are different levels of in between the ultra micro and the ultra macro marketing. So we talked about segmentation and differentiation, more or less that we're kind of picking a segment based on a large demographic, psychographic, or behavioral group, but we can even target within that group. So a concentrated niche marketing might be something where we take two different segments and we kind of, in a sense, combine them. So older people who live in the Northeast that like pizza might be something that's more concentrated. So when you select target market segments, the positives and negatives are different ones. So when you're doing undifferentiated, you don't have to do as much research, because you're putting out the same message. You're kind of this is what I call maybe a Tom Hanks approach, that Tom Hanks is a popular celebrity with my grandmother, but also with my grandchildren or future grandchildren. He has a broad appeal, and therefore you don't have to do research. You know that he's well liked, and therefore you don't have to do all the legwork of figuring out what the segmentations are. But you're also passing up kind of the segmentation opportunities. Differentiated segmented marketing is that you can be associated, perhaps overly associated with one particular group, and because the way that identity is formed, if you're associated with one particular type of consumer, you might have a negative reaction from other consumers. So A good example of this was NASCAR, that was mostly targeting kind of a southern regional market historically in the 1980s, tried to broaden its appeal and kind of changed the rules to appeal to a broader market, first to women, but then also to outside of the South, the Northeast, and the West. And you saw this in terms of changing their schedule and having more dates outside of, like, say, their southern tour circuit. Um, so Etsy, which is, kind of makes, I'm going to say, narrowly targeted products. So a lot of things that are artistic, or I want something that is blue, made in a certain way, and I don't want to just buy it in the store. Etsy kind of is a platform that allows people to do concentrated marketing strategies to basically make homemade items that are very specific. So here is not just, let's say, soap on a rope, but it has a political theme, and connected to Barack Obama. And you kind of see this in terms, even not just with Barack Obama, but even more like Trump, that Trump has become kind of a brand that is very attractive to certain people, and not attractive to other people. One thing that I think you're going to see is when, marketing catches up and people are making face coverings and scarves and masks. I think that when you can't see people's face, people are going to use masks as a way to kind of convey their identity. And I think what you're going to see is people using different fabrics and designs and messages on their masks to kind of differentiate themselves. And I'm sure someone who's able to kind of serve a variety of different niches in the market is going to be able to make face coverings and make a very good business making masks for people. Micro marketing. Tailoring products, basically micro marketing is individualize the marketing to a local area. So you see this where, like, local food. You see this in terms of selling a lot of boutique stores. I live in Orange County, New York, and there are town-specific stores that sell kind of nostalgic things, or things that kind of are more appealing to a rural, sensibility than what you might see, let's say, in terms of a chain store. Some of this might be that it can be a mom and pop single store versus a chain store, and therefore tied to the what people want to buy in a particular area that might not translate to a larger market. And I talked about, particularly with the internet and e-marketing, you've seen a lot more tailoring to how individual internet browsers and customers. And so along that point is that you see this with GPS devices, which every single phone is a GPS device, that as your phone is paying things, you will get things like Starbucks offers. And I realize that this is a very old phone, flip phone, but I think that the principle is the same, and you're seeing this, that ads are tied to local areas, and they can basically target you even to whether being an aisle of a large retail or grocery store. So one example of that is that there are video screens in stores that they can actually tell who's looking at it, and they will vary by who's watching that, whether by your devices or anything that has kind of your e-signature on it, that they will change based on who's watching it. I think it seems a little bit too much Big Brother for me, but the idea is that you're using your marketing resources most efficiently in this way. So some factors to consider when choosing a targeting strategy. Once again, not every company has the same resources. Not everything is a chain. Not everyone can produce the variety of products for all the different segments in the market. Some products are, like, say, in different stages of the life cycle, might not be able to. If you're in a declining market or a rising market, you might not know what your segment is yet. It might be more in flux. And lastly, you always have to respond to what's in your environment, particularly competitors. Your marketing strategy might be setting, if your competitor is zigging, you want to zag, and you don't want to necessarily, have a direct confrontation in terms of your marketing strategy, because otherwise you might get a confusion in your strategy. People might associate you with your competitor, and that's not necessarily the way to go. So. So very often, when you target by groups, you're basically engaging in stereotypes. And I think what happens when you engage in stereotypes is that some of these stereotypes are not positive. Some of these stereotypes are taking advantage of people in vulnerable positions. some of these people are, minors, and therefore you are targeting people who it's kind of maybe illegitimate or irresponsible to target them with messages because they don't have the ability to understand the messaging to them the same way that adults do. And so probably the best example of this is that cigarettes used to be targeted at not just at teenagers, but at like middle school students. And so Joe Camel, using cartoons and using kind of a hipness, was deliberately targeting children with their products. Another example of this was in 1980s. Animated programs like the Transformers and Voltron, whatever, were basically one long advertisement for their product. In the vein of kind of like, say, entertaining children. And so there are sometimes regulations of these things, but also like it's probably not socially responsible to approach it that way. So one maybe example of this is that Victoria's Secret is intimate wear, generally targeted at adults, and I'm sure some of you some of you might own some of this merchandise. Its pink line is kind of something that was targeted at teenagers, and also things that were kind of written on various parts of the anatomy that kind of sexualized people that were underage. And a lot of people asked whether Victoria's Secret was being socially responsible targeting minors, particularly with like a niche marketing. And yes, it might be very effective, but it might not be appropriate.